Tomorrow's Careers. Presented by the Johns Hopkins University and the ABC Television Network from the studios of WAAM in Baltimore. Each week, the Johns Hopkins University presents the highlights of a different career to show you the story of the men who worked in it, their preparation and rewards, and an insight into the problems they solved. This week, we bring you the career of the archaeologist. And here to introduce the story of the archaeologist is your host from the Johns Hopkins University, Lynn Poole.
When we're speaking about an archaeologist, we realize that he must be a man with an assortment of skills and talent, a real assortment. Now, the archaeologist must have a curiosity and the daring of an explorer. He must also have the objectivity and the patience of a real scholar. Then, of course, in addition to this, he must speak many languages. Then, he often finds himself in the role of a fundraiser so that his expeditions can take place. And then when he goes to foreign lands, he has to be a diplomat and a leader of men. Well, now, our guest tonight is one of the great archaeologists of our time. He's preeminent in all of these qualities. Our guest is Professor William F. Albright, who is the Spence Professor of Semitic Languages at the Johns Hopkins University. But before we meet him and hear what he has to say about archaeology, let's take a quick glance at what the archaeologist does and why he does it. Now, we can do this best through some examples of what the archaeologist finds in the buried civilizations of the past. One of the interesting types of things revealed by archaeological expedition is art, such as you see here. As a matter of fact, archaeology originally began as a search for rare objects of beauty, and some of our artists and designers today have taken inspiration from ancient art, but the modern archaeologist is not a treasure hunter. Art to him is really a byproduct of the science of piecing together, matter of fact, quite literally sometimes, piecing together the story, the life, the customs, the thoughts, the buildings, the life of the ancient world. Well, now you might say, what good is all this knowledge? Why dig up all these things and study them? Well, first of all, we have to admit that there's the fascination, the real fascination of going to foreign countries and pursuing buried secrets, of learning about whole civilizations that were unrecorded in history, and learn a lot about them. But even more important than that, archaeology gives us a richer knowledge of our past from which our own ideas and our customs, and our sciences, and our religions grew. We learn a lot about ourselves from studying the past. We ask a lot of questions. When did Israel settle in Canaan under Joshua? Was Solomon a great builder and a merchant prince, as we could infer from the Bible? Now, these are just a few of the questions which archaeologists find answers to every day. They add to our knowledge. And in finding these answers, the archaeologist is really like a detective, except that he seeks to restore civilizations and not track down criminals. The archaeologist works with facts and clues, and these clues lead to other facts. And like the detective, he works with scientists, such as the biologist or the paleontologist who studies fossils, and the chemist and the physicist. In fact, in a moment, we're going to hear how a fascinating story of how a chemist contributed to archaeology and discovered a lot about the past. But as I was saying a moment ago, the archaeologist is not primarily concerned with finding buried treasure. For instance, a copper coin may be far more interesting to him than a gold one. He's not seeking just gold, because if this copper coin is dated, it will help him fix the date of the building in which this copper coin was found. And then the age of the building may in turn establish the date of other articles found in that building. This is how he learns about the past. Now, these are the kinds of clues that the archaeologist collects as he uncovers the past. And by accumulating many such clues, the archaeologist reconstructs the events, the lives, the communities, the history, the life of the people that shaped our entire history. Archaeologists, for instance, have found the details of the life inscribed in the epics of Homer and have proven that the epics of Homer are literally true. They found legal codes 4,000 years old, which very closely resemble the Mosaic Law. But how can an archaeologist say with absolute certainty that an object like this or a writing is beyond question and absolutely 5,000 or 3,500 years old? What methods do they use to date these things? Well, basically, there are two methods.
The oldest method of determining the age of objects is by matching them with other datable objects in the same style. From the earliest times, style and fashion have dominated the design of useful objects and works of art. The archaeologist of the near future will not need to do much research to establish when an automobile was manufactured. Nor will he have difficulty in establishing the date of women's dresses. Although the styles of the ancients did not change as rapidly as ours, they did run in sequences which are easy to date. For instance, the trained archaeologist can readily identify these fragments of pottery as belonging to Palestine of the 13th century BC. And one can notice the similarity in design between these fragments from the 20th century BC, which are characterized by designs made by notches rather than paint. These seals, or scarabs, as they're called, which were worn as rings and used to validate documents, also had designs peculiar to certain periods and are a good indication of the date of an excavated layer. Another method, carbon-14 testing, to determine the age of an object of antiquity, is based on scientific knowledge that most living matter, such as trees, contain a certain amount of radioactive carbon. At the death of the living matter, the radioactive carbon disintegrates at a very slow but uniform rate. To determine the age of an ancient object made of organic material, such as this wooden figurine, small fragments of the object are burned, and the gases which contain radioactive carbon-14 are captured in a heavily shielded vessel, and the radioactive emissions are measured by a Geiger counter. When it is established how much carbon-14 has disintegrated since the death of a tree from which this object was made, scientists can determine how many years it would take for this disintegration, and thus they deduce the age of the object.
Now, a little later, we're going to find out from Dr. Albright how his scholarly work contributed to one of the greatest archaeological finds in history, the Dead Sea Scrolls, about which I'm sure many of you have heard. But first, as we meet Dr. Albright, let's ask him to first tell us how he goes about his work as an archaeologist.
Well, there are a great many different kinds of archaeology covering many countries and many times. I myself am a specialist, as you've heard, on the archaeology of the ancient Near East. That is, the lands which form the cradle of our Western civilization, the lands which we call Bible lands, because all of them appear in the Bible itself or in immediate connection with the Bible. Now, my own interest lies particularly in reconstructing the history of this ancient civilization from which our own was derived, so I am particularly interested, and always have been, in digging mounds. There are different kinds of mounds, but all of them are generally flat-topped hills with sloping sides, representing the remains of ancient walled towns or walled villages or walled fortresses, which are found scattered by the tens of thousands all over the lands of the ancient East, from the Mediterranean to India and from southern Russia to the Indian Ocean. I'm going to talk briefly about mounds in South Arabia and mounds in Palestine. In South Arabia, from 1950 onwards, the American Foundation for the Study of Man, directed by Dr. Wendell Phillips, has carried on excavations, and among the many sites we have dug there is the site of Hajar bin Humeid, which you will see here. Hajar bin Humeid is a typical mound for South Arabia. It's about 50 feet in height from virgin soil to the top, and it has a flat top and a sloping side. This is somewhat steeper than usually is the case because right adjacent to the mound was a valley with a stream bed down which flash floods poured at intervals several times a year often for the last 2,000 years, and they have gradually eaten away the side of the hill until we have reached here about 1/3 the distance from the original wall at the edge of the mound to the heart of the mound, its center. Well, now if we start with virgin soil down here, it's about 1000 BC. You'll find after the first settlement this dark layer here, which is a layer of ashes representing the destruction by fire of one of the early towns. And you notice this mud brick wall, which is simply the foundations and lower part of an originally higher wall. The foundations are naturally below the floor level. And this site may have been occupied for, 100 years perhaps, or possibly a little more. And in the course of time, there were different houses built, and sometimes they fell to pieces. And so there's quite a history in each one of these layers. And as time went on, a new stratum or layer was established, and you will see here a similar dark ash-filled layer just above the floors with a house wall with foundations a little below the floors. And so you go on over the period of 1,000 years or so to the Christian era. And here you have a very thick ash layer representing a tremendous destruction, the destruction by fire of this period, and then of various squatters' settlements which are built up after its destruction. This is a stone wall with blocks of a very hard granite which had to be fashioned perhaps weeks for each block because steel was then unknown. We come around to these shelves which show you the different types of pottery which are used in each period on the shelves bearing a given kind of pottery, being against the model reconstructed at the level. This model, by the way, has been prepared by the Chrysler Corporation on specification drawn by Dr. G.W. Van Beek, who is now preparing the volume which will describe this unique pottery sequence in South Arabia, which he helped to dig out in 1951. I might say in this connection that you learn from the slides shown before on the screen that different periods have different types of pottery. One period, for instance, will have pottery with painted decoration. Another period, pottery with notched or combed decoration. So you can tell different types of pottery apart in the same way that you can tell different periods of other things such as automobiles or styles and so on. In this plan here, you have a vertical cross-section of a typical Palestinian mound. The principle is the same. You see on the edge the substructures and foundations of destroyed city walls and the various strata. Sometimes the areas are very much larger than this schematic plan, and sometimes you may have 15 or 20 layers, one over the other. The next slide will show the appearance of one of these strata after the debris has been removed from between the ruined walls, and then there's a slide which will illustrate the appearance of a plan after the destruction of the walls, after the walls in question have been bared. Here you'll see the city wall, and here is a house, another house, and a small alley. All these remains belong to the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, about 700 to 589 BC. The town was destroyed by the Chaldeans, or Babylonians, in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar.
Well, now, about 8 years ago, some finds were made in a cave near the Dead Sea. And these finds came about 8 years ago, just south of Jericho, led to the discovery of a manual of discipline belonging to a Jewish cult called the Essenes. Now, the first scrolls prove to date from the last 150 years BC. And this made them the oldest known biblical manuscripts. So it was quite exciting to archaeologists, to scholars, to biblical scholars all over the world when these were found. And because Dr. Albright has done so much work on them, I'd like to ask him if he'd come in and tell us more about these manuals of discipline and what these manuals of discipline signify.
Well, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has resulted in the finding of some 400 manuscripts, a few complete or nearly complete, most of them preserved only in fragments. They're all found in these caves south of Jericho above the Dead Sea. These scrolls belong to the long-lost literature of the Essenes, who were the third most important Jewish sect after the Pharisees and Sadducees who are mentioned in the New Testament. The Essenes are mentioned not in the New Testament at all, but in contemporary Jewish writings, such as those of Josephus and Philo. The Essenes were much closer related to the New Testament Christianity, which we find in the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, and so on, than anything which we have in other Jewish sources. Their discovery has been a revelation. In the first place, we now know much better than we ever dreamed we would the immediate Jewish background of the New Testament. We have here in the Scroll of Discipline an account of the beliefs and practices of the Essenes, and in other literature which is being deciphered and published in these years, we have a great deal of supplementary material. We're going to know 100 times more about the background in Judaism of the New Testament than we ever dreamed we would. One result is that we find the immediate sources of a good many practices of New Testament times. For instance, the 12 leaders of the people, the overseers, in Hebrew, mevakarim, who are the direct source of the Christian overseers or bishops. And then we have a primitive form of baptism and a primitive form of the Lord's Supper, without the specifically Christian connotations, because these people were not Christians, but Jews. The most important for me of all these things is the discovery that now there's nothing whatever against dating the New Testament books where they purport to date, without considering many of them as late apocrypha, that is to say, as forgeries, as is done, I regret to say, by a large proportion of our modern New Testament scholars. Almost the whole of this elaborate structure of New Testament scholarship turns out to be factitious. It's arbitrary, and there's no basis to it at all.
Well, as you can see, part of the work of the archaeologist and a scholar such as Dr. Albright is translating the literature of the time. Now, when these scrolls were found, photographs were taken immediately, and they were sent directly to Baltimore to Dr. Albright. Why? Because scholars said that he was the one man that could tell whether or not these scrolls were authentic. Were they real? Did they come from the time? So they sent them to him, he studied them, and he said, yes, they are authentic. Dr. Albright, how did you go about giving authenticity to these scrolls?
Because when I examined the Leica prints, which Dr. John C. Trevor sent me in early 1948 with a lens, I was astonished at the extremely early forms of letters. I had devoted very close attention years before to the development of the Hebrew and Aramaic script in the last centuries BC and the first centuries AD, and I found certain developments changing in forms of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which placed the Dead Sea Scrolls in the last 2 centuries BC. I'll give an illustration of the form of the letter M, our M, Hebrew Mem, in different periods. Remember that the Hebrew alphabet and the Latin alphabet, which we use today, are originally the same. If we go back to the age of the patriarchs, about 1500 BC, we find an M which generally looks like this. If we come down to about 1100 BC, it's written vertically like this. If we come to about 1950 BC, it is written this with a prolongation of the lowest stroke. About the 9th century BC down to 800, it is written like this. Now this is the form of the letter. At the time it was borrowed by the Greeks, and as you see, this is the earliest archaic Greek mu, and our Latin M is simply a slight modification with a shortened shaft. Then in about 750 BC we find this form developing, a more curvilinear form. As we come down to 600 BC, it's shaped more or less like this sort of thing. Then about 400 BC, it continues to be shaped like this latter form. In the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have various forms, of which this is a typical one, which changes in about AD 50 to forms like this being a final one and this an intermediate one. So you see that you have the modern Hebrew forms already developed as early as about 1900 years ago. If we turn to the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, we find similar changes within a shorter period of time, of course. For instance, take the letter H. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in some of the earliest Dead Sea Scrolls, we find this form of the letter H, this form. Then in the Dead Sea Scroll, Isaiah, and the Manual of Discipline, we find this type of script. In the later Dead Sea Scrolls, we find it like this. In the period at the end of the Dead Sea Scroll, we find it already approximating the modern H. Then again, if we take the letter S, we find in the earliest Dead Sea Scrolls a form like this, with an open bottom or lower side, left-hand side. Later, in the later Dead Sea Scrolls, after the Manual of Discipline, we find it closed in the bottom like the modern S of today. And so, in the letter K, for instance, we have in the Dead Sea Isaiah this kind of a form. Whereas in a little later we find it's dividing into two forms, one in the middle like this, which is nearly the same as the modern one, and the other the form at the end, which is simplified from the one you see here. In this way we're able to tell the difference between scripts and their development. It is possible, by comparing hundreds of hands, which we find in these 400 manuscripts and their fragments, to determine, as my pupil, Dr. Frank M. Cross, Jr., who got his degree at the Hopkins with me several years ago, the date of nearly all of the Dead Sea Scrolls within narrow limits by comparing them with each other and with dated documents from the same period. They cover a maximum duration of some 300 years.
I'm sure that a number of you will be interested in knowing how you go about becoming an archaeologist and following in the path of such a scholar as Dr. Albright. So let's turn the question to Dr. Albright and ask you.
Well, now, it's impossible to set up a norm, a pattern, which all archaeologists are going to follow. One archaeologist became an archaeologist because he was interested in amateur photography. And he became the leading specialist in the history of Islamic, that is, Mohammedan architecture in Arab countries. Another, and he's characteristic of many, was first and foremost a trained architect, and he became interested in historical architecture. Still a third was originally a surveyor. Another was an engraver. Still another was a draftsman. Another was a student of ancient languages. Still another was a student of ancient history. All these skills and more others are useful for the archaeologist. The main thing for a young man who wants to become an archaeologist is willingness to work his head off, a vivid imagination, enthusiasm for pushing the boundaries of knowledge out in some direction, a good visual memory, an eye for form are very useful indeed, and then again, an interest in the history of mankind, especially in the history of human civilization, in the history of gadgets, the history of science, the history of ideas even. All of these things are useful pointers in the direction of an archaeological career. But since archaeology is so varied and there's so many different phases to it, it's quite possible for a boy to become an archaeologist no matter what his start is. Of course, he has to have a potentially good mind, but as you know, most people have potentially good minds. What they do need is a keen interest and indefatigable industry. It's impossible to become a good archaeologist unless you're a genius of first water, which almost nobody is, or a man who's willing to take infinite pains, like the late Mr. Edison. Edison certainly was capable of taking infinite pains, and so it is true of the men who become great archaeologists, like Sir Flinders Petrie.
Well, as you can see from what Dr. Albright says, you've got to be able to work hard. You've got to get a good background, but the thing you've got to have above all is tremendous enthusiasm for the past and translating it into the future, and have a great curiosity. And curiosity is one of the things that will stand you in good stead. A thing that you have will help you to be a good archaeologist. Perhaps you have curiosity, but you don't want to be an archaeologist. Well, there are a lot of other things to use your curiosity on, and one of them is a career we're going to discuss with you next week. And that career, which needs a lot of curiosity, also a lot of hard work, but a love of working with people, is the career of the librarian.
Tomorrow's Careers is produced by Lynn Poole. Associate producers are Leo Geyer and Edmund Levy. Directors, Kennard Kelty and Herbert B. Cahan. Art direction by Barry Mansfield. Your narrator has been Ted Jaffe. Tomorrow's Careers originates through the facilities of WAAM in Baltimore. Have fun. See Super Circus tomorrow on ABC Television Network.